The school bell rang, a sharp, shrill sound that cut through the air and signaled freedom. For most kids, it was a race to the doors, a flood of noise and energy as they poured out into the afternoon sun. For him, it was different. He was part of the flood, but not really. He moved with the current, a silent piece of driftwood in a rushing river. Conversations swirled around him, plans for the weekend. Complaints about a test. Jokes he didn't quite understand, but they were like background music in a store he wasn't shopping in. He was just there. In the classroom, he was the kid who sat in the back by the window. His teachers knew his name, of course, but it often took them a moment to remember it when calling the roll. They'd pause, their eyes scanning the room, and land on him with a flicker of recognition before moving on. He never raised his hand. It wasn't that he didn't know the answers. Sometimes he did. But the thought of all those heads turning, all those eyes focusing on him, made his stomach feel tight. It was easier to just be quiet. To be the empty space in the room. He walked home the same way every day, a path worn into the pavement by his own 2 feet. He passed the old corner store, the park where younger kids screamed on the swings, and the houses with their neat lawns and barking dogs. He saw it all, but he felt like he was watching it through a screen. He was a spectator in his own town. The only thing that felt real, that felt like it truly belonged to him, was waiting in the garage. His house was small, a simple place with a tired-looking porch and a lawn that was more weeds than grass. But the garage, that was his kingdom. It was a messy, cluttered space filled with his dad's old tools, paint cans that were rusting at the edges, and the faint, constant smell of oil and sawdust. It wasn't fancy, but it was quiet. It was private. Tucked away in the corner, leaning against a workbench, was his guitar. It wasn't a new, shiny thing. It was a beat-up old acoustic, a Yamaha from the 70s, with scratches and dents that each told a story. The finish was cracked in a few places, and one of the tuning pegs was a little stiff, but to him it was perfect. It had belonged to his dad. His dad, a man who worked with his hands, whose palms were as rough as sandpaper and whose back ached every night. A man who, once upon a time, had dreamed of stages and spotlights, but had traded that dream for a steady job and a family. When the boy picked up the guitar, it felt like more than just wood and metal. It felt like a connection. He closed the heavy garage door, shutting out the world. And the moment his fingers touched the strings, everything would change. The boy who was invisible at school, who faded into the background at home, disappeared. In his place was someone else, someone with a voice. His fingers, which fumbled with a pen or a fork, would dance across the fretboard. They knew exactly where to go, pressing down on the strings with a confidence he never had in real life. He'd start with a few simple chords, letting the sound fill the small space. The notes would hang in the dusty air, clean and pure. Then he would close his eyes and the music would just flow. It wasn't just noise. It was everything he couldn't say. It was the loneliness he felt walking through the hallways, the frustration of not being able to speak up, the quiet observations he made about the world around him. All of it was channeled through the 6 steel strings. He could spend hours in there, lost in the melodies, until the sun went down and the garage grew dark. The music was his best friend, his diary, his shield. His dad was his only audience. Some evenings, just as the boy was getting lost in a song, he'd hear the heavy sound of work boots on the driveway. The garage door would creak open, and there his dad would stand, framed in the doorway, his face tired and smudged with dirt from a long day of work. He never said much. He'd just lean against the doorframe, his arms crossed over his chest, and listen. A small, tired smile would often play on his lips. The boy could see it in his eyes, a look that was a mix of pride and something else. A kind of gentle sadness, maybe. A memory of a dream he once had. Sometimes, after the boy finished a song, his dad would just nod. "That's good, son," he'd say, his voice a low rumble. "That's real good." And that was enough. It was more than enough. It was the only applause he ever needed, one evening. A few weeks before his dad's 50th birthday, the boy walked into the living room and found his dad sitting on the edge of the sofa, staring at something in his hands. It was an old, faded photograph. The boy crept closer, trying not to make a sound. In the picture, a much younger version of his dad, with long hair and a hopeful look in his eyes, was standing on a stage with a guitar strapped to his shoulder. He was smiling, a wide, carefree smile the boy rarely saw. His dad looked up, a little startled, and quickly tried to put the photo away. But the boy had already seen it. He had seen the look on his dad's face, the look of a man remembering a different life, a different version of himself. In that moment, an idea began to form in the boy's mind. It was a scary idea, one that made his hands feel clammy and his heart beat a little too fast. But it was also the only idea that felt right. He had to do something. He had to give his dad a gift that wasn't just a thing. A gift that could show him that his dream wasn't gone, that it was still alive, right here in this house, waiting in the garage. The idea, once planted in his mind, began to grow like a weed in the cracks of his quiet life. It was a terrifying idea, but it was also the only one that seemed to matter. For his dad's 50th birthday, he wouldn't buy a tie or a new tool. He would give him a memory. He would give him the sound of his own son's music, not just in the quiet garage, but in a place where dreams were supposed to happen. The first step was finding the place. He'd heard people at school talk about an open mic night, a weekly event at a bar on the other side of town. A quick search on his old, slow computer brought it up: The Rusty Nail, open mic every Thursday. The name alone sounded rough, like a place that didn't suffer fools. It sounded perfect. It sounded terrifying. He spent the next few days practicing with a new kind of fever. The music in the garage was no longer just for him. It was for his dad. Every note he played was filtered through the image of his father's tired face, the memory of the old photograph. He wanted to get it right. He wanted the song to be a thank you, a tribute, a way of saying, "I see you. I see the dream you put away from me." But the pressure made his fingers feel clumsy. Notes he'd played 100 times suddenly sounded wrong. Chords that were usually smooth and easy felt awkward under his trembling hands. He'd get frustrated, setting the guitar down with a thud, the sound echoing his own disappointment. But then he'd close his eyes, take a deep breath, and picture his dad listening in the doorway, that small, proud smile on his face. And he'd pick up the guitar again. Finally, he knew he couldn't put it off any longer. He had to sign up. He decided to go to the bar in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, figuring it would be empty. The walk felt longer than it ever had before. The guitar case in his hand felt like a lead weight, broadcasting his intention to anyone who might look. But no one did. He was still invisible. The rusty nail, in the daylight, looked even more worn out than he'd imagined. The paint on the sign was peeling and the windows were grimy. He pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The smell hit him first, a stale mix of old beer, cigarette smoke that had soaked into the walls, and something vaguely like fried food. The place was mostly empty, just a few older men sitting at the bar, not talking, just staring into their drinks. A burly man with a thick beard was wiping down the counter with a dirty rag. The boy's heart hammered against his ribs. He felt like an alien who had landed on the wrong planet. He walked up to the bar, his sneakers sticking to the floor with every step. "Excuse me," he mumbled, his voice barely a whisper. The bartender looked up, his eyes bored and uninterested. "Yeah? I was wondering how to sign up for the open mic night." The man grunted and pointed a thumb towards a clipboard hanging on a nail behind the bar. "Just put your name down. Thursday, 9 o'clock. Be here by 8:30. The boy scribbled his name on a line near the bottom of the sheet, his handwriting shaky. He felt a strange mix of relief and dread. It was done. There was no turning back. The days that followed were a blur of school and anxiety. He felt like he was walking around with a huge secret. At lunch, while other kids laughed and shared food, he would sit alone, running through the song in his head. In class, he'd stare out the window, not seeing the clouds or the birds, but seeing the stage at the Rusty Nail, imagining all those eyes on him. The fear was a constant cold knot in his stomach, but underneath it there was something else, a tiny, flickering spark of purpose. He was doing this for his dad. That thought became his shield against the fear. Thursday night arrived. The air in the house felt thick with unspoken words. His dad knew he was going out, but he didn't know where. The boy had just said he was meeting a friend. It felt like a lie, but he didn't know how to explain it. How could he explain this huge, terrifying thing he was about to do? He slung the guitar case over his shoulder, his mom giving him a small, curious smile from the couch. "Have a good time," she said. He just nodded, his throat too tight to speak. The walk to the bar was cold. The streetlights cast long, spooky shadows on the sidewalk. With every step, the voice in his head got louder. Asterisk, you can't do this. They're going to laugh at you. Just go home. Play in the garage where it's safe, asterisk, but he kept walking. He thought of his dad's hands, rough and worn from a lifetime of work. He kept walking. When he pushed open the door to the rusty nail, the difference from the daytime was like a punch to the face. The place was packed. The air was thick with smoke and the loud, overlapping noise of dozens of conversations. The jukebox was blasting some classic rock song, but it was barely audible over the roar of the crowd. People were shouting to be heard, laughing loudly, clinking bottles and glasses. This wasn't a place for music. This was a place to get drunk. He felt a wave of panic wash over him. He found the host, a skinny guy with a goatee and a tired-looking t-shirt, who was setting up a single microphone on a tiny stage in the corner. The host barely looked at him, just checked his name on the clipboard. "You're on after the poet?" "Probably around 10. "Just hang out? Hang out? Where?" He felt like a spotlight was already on him, even though no one was paying him any attention. He found a small, empty table in the darkest corner he could find and sat down, keeping his guitar case close to him like a life raft. He watched the people around him. A group of women in work uniforms, cackling at a table. 2 men arguing about sports at the bar. A couple in a corner, lost in their own world. None of them cared about the stage. None of them cared about the music. He was completely and utterly alone in a room full of people. He watched the first performer, a woman with a keyboard who sang a song that was lovely but completely drowned out by the chatter. No one clapped. Then came the poet, a nervous man who read his poems about heartbreak into a sea of indifference. The boy's stomach churned. This was a mistake. A huge, horrible mistake. Then he heard the host's voice, cutting through the noise. "All right, next up. We got..." He looked down at the clipboard, squinting. "We got..." The kid with the guitar. "Come on up." The boy felt his blood run cold. This was it. The host's voice echoed in his head, a distant call in a fog of fear. The kid with the guitar. That was him. He was just a kid. And he had a guitar. For a moment he thought about staying put. He could just shake his head, mouth the word, no, and sink deeper into the shadows of his corner. But then he thought of his dad, of the tired smile, of the old photograph. He couldn't let that dream down. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping against the sticky floor, a sound that was swallowed instantly by the bar's roar. He stood up, his legs feeling like they were made of rubber. The short walk to the stage felt like crossing a vast, dangerous canyon. He kept his eyes down, focused on the worn-out floorboards, trying to avoid the sea of faces that he knew were not looking at him anyway. He could feel the vibrations of the conversations through the solace of his sneakers, a chaotic energy that made his teeth ache. He clutched the handle of his guitar case so tightly his knuckles were white. He climbed the 3 steps onto the small stage, the world tilting slightly. It was just a raised piece of wood in the corner of the room, but up here, it felt like he was on display in a museum of awkwardness. He fumbled with the latches on his guitar case, his fingers refusing to cooperate properly. Finally, it snapped open. He lifted out the old Yamaha, its familiar weight a small comfort in this terrifying new world. He sat down on the wobbly stool the host had left there, feeling like he might tip over at any second. He adjusted the microphone, pulling it closer to his face. The metal was cold against his fingertips. As he moved it, a high-pitched squeal of feedback ripped through the bar, a nails-on-a-chalkboard sound that made a few people flinch and glare in his direction. His face burned with heat. He felt like an imposter, a child who had wandered into a grown-up world and was about to be exposed. He took a deep breath, the air thick and smoky. He could feel the sweat on his forehead. He looked out, not at the faces, but at the back wall, at a faded beer poster. He had to say something, anything. He leaned into the microphone, his heart thumping a wild, frantic rhythm against his ribs. "Hi," he mumbled. The sound was so small, so thin, it was a miracle the microphone even picked it up. He swallowed hard, his throat dry as dust. He thought of his dad again. He wasn't playing for these people. He was playing for him. This is an original song," he managed to say, his voice shaking. It's for my dad." The dedication hung in the air for a second. It was a strange, intimate thing to say in this loud, public place. A few heads turned. Not many, but a few. A woman at a table near the stage, who had been in the middle of a loud story, stopped talking and looked up. The bartender, who was polishing a glass with mechanical efficiency, paused for a fraction of a second, his eyes flicking towards the stage. It was just a tiny ripple, but it was something. It was a crack in the wall of indifference. He closed his eyes. It was the only way. He shut out the lights, the faces, the smoke, the noise. He created a darkness that was just for him and his guitar. He pictured his garage, the quiet, the smell of sawdust and oil. He pictured his dad leaning in the doorway. And then he played. The first chord wasn't a simple, strummed thing. It was a cascade of notes, a complex, finger-picked melody that rang out with a clarity and a richness that felt completely out of place. It was a clean, pure sound that cut through the grime and the noise of the bar like a sharp knife. The notes were filled with a deep, aching melancholy, a sense of longing that was so profound it was almost physical. It was the sound of loneliness, but also of hope. It was the sound of a story waiting to be told. The effect was immediate and startling. The loud conversation at the nearest table didn't just stop. It fizzled out like a balloon with a slow leak. The woman who had been telling the story turned her head, her mouth slightly open. The man she was with followed her gaze. The sound traveled further, a quiet wave washing over the room. A group of men at the bar, who had been arguing about a football game, fell silent one by one. The bartender put down his glass and his rag, turning his full attention to the stage. The cynical musician who had played before him, who was nursing a beer in the back, straightened up, his expression one of pure shock. Up on the stage, the boy was gone. In his place was the musician. He was no longer aware of the crowd or the stage or the sticky floor. His fingers, which had been trembling just moments before, moved with a steady, confident grace. They knew the fretboard like they knew their own home. Each note was precise, each transition smooth. He was pouring everything into the music. All the years of being invisible, all the words he couldn't say, all the feelings he kept locked away, they were all flowing out through the 6 steel strings. The guitar was no longer just an instrument. It was his voice, and then he began to sing. His voice was not what anyone expected. It wasn't powerful or polished. It was soft, a little rough around the edges, like an old, comfortable blanket. But it was filled with a raw, unfiltered emotion that grabbed hold of you and wouldn't let go. He sang about calloused hands and weary backs. He sang about deferred dreams and the quiet sacrifices made for love. He sang about watching a hero come home every night, too tired to smile but still finding the strength to care. The lyrics were simple, direct, and honest. They were not poetry. They were truth. And in the noisy, chaotic world of the Rusty Nail, truth was a rare and powerful thing. The song began to build, moving from the gentle, reflective verse into a more powerful chorus. His voice grew stronger, filled with a soaring sense of gratitude and love. The music swelled around him, the melody becoming more intricate, more passionate. He was no longer just sitting on a wobbly stool in a corner bar. He was standing on a mountain shouting his heart out to the world. And for the first time all night, the world was listening. The entire bar was held captive, wrapped in the spell of his song. The air was thick with a shared, unspoken feeling. The boy they had all ignored was playing a song that was speaking to every single one of them. The music swelled, filling every corner of the smoky bar. It was no longer just a song. It was a living, breathing thing. The boy on the stool was its heart, and the old guitar was its voice. His fingers moved with a speed and precision that seemed impossible for someone so awkward in his own skin. The melody was intricate and beautiful, weaving a story that didn't need words to be understood. It was the sound of hard work, of quiet dignity, of a love that asks for nothing in return. And as the song reached its chorus, his voice, which had started as a soft whisper, grew stronger, filled with a power that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him. From a place he'd never known existed, the room was completely transformed. The loud, chaotic energy from just a few minutes ago had vanished, replaced by a thick, heavy silence. It was the kind of silence you could feel, a shared, sacred space created by the music. The woman who had been telling the loud story was now leaning forward, her elbows on the table, her face turned towards the stage. Her friend, who had been laughing, now had a single tear tracing a path through her makeup. They weren't just listening. They were feeling it. The song was reaching into their own memories, their own regrets, their own loves. At the bar, the burly bartender stood perfectly still. The rag he'd been using to wipe a glass was draped over his hand, forgotten. His usual bored, cynical expression was gone, replaced by something softer, something vulnerable. He was staring at the boy, a look of pure disbelief on his face. He'd seen thousands of performers come through this place, most of them forgettable. But this was different. This was real. He felt a lump form in his own throat. A memory of a dream he'd once had, a long, long time ago, surfacing from a place he thought had been buried forever. In the back corner, the musician who had played his own set of angry, loud songs just an hour earlier was watching with his mouth slightly agape. He had written this kid off the moment he saw him. Another wannabe with a guitar, thinking he had something to say. But now he felt a strange mix of shame and awe. This quiet, invisible kid was playing with more soul, more raw honesty than he ever had. The music wasn't just good. It was a mirror reflecting back all the ways he'd compromised his own art, all the passion he'd traded for cynicism. He felt a sudden, desperate urge to go home, pick up his own guitar, and try to remember why he started playing in the first place. Even the couple who had been arguing in hushed, angry tones had fallen silent. The man, who had been gesturing wildly, now had his hands resting on the table, his fists unclenched. The woman, who had been staring down at her drink, was now looking at him, her expression softening. The boy's song about sacrifice and unspoken love was bridging the gap between them, reminding them of the good that was buried under the weight of their daily frustrations. Under the cover of the dim lighting, the man reached across the table and gently took his wife's hand. She didn't pull away. Up on the stage, the boy was lost in a world of his own creation. His eyes were still closed, his face tilted towards the single spotlight. He wasn't thinking about the chords or the lyrics anymore. He wasn't even aware of the audience. He was just a conduit for the music. He could feel the energy of the room, a wave of focused attention that washed over him, but it didn't scare him. It fueled him. He poured every ounce of his being into the final verse. His voice cracked slightly on a high note, not from a lack of skill, but from the sheer weight of emotion behind it. It was a perfectly imperfect moment, a raw display of humanity that made the song even more powerful. The music began to build towards its peak. The tempo quickened, his fingers flying across the fretboard in a flurry of notes that were both complex and melodic. It was a guitar solo, but it wasn't flashy or self-indulgent. It was a continuation of the story, a cry from the heart that said everything the words couldn't. Each note was a question, a memory, a declaration. The sound was so full, so rich, it seemed to bounce off the grimy walls and ceiling, cleansing the room of all its tired cynicism. People were leaning forward in their seats, their bodies swaying slightly with the rhythm, completely mesmerized. It was as if the entire bar was holding its breath, waiting to see where this incredible journey of sound would lead. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the storm of music passed. The flurry of notes slowed, the melody softened, and he brought the song to a close. He didn't fade out. He played a final, resonant chord, a single, powerful note that was filled with all the love and gratitude he felt for his father. He held the note, letting it hang in the air, a perfect, shimmering sound in the sudden, deafening silence. He let his fingers fall away from the strings, and the last vibration of the note echoed in the quiet room, slowly fading into nothing. For what felt like an eternity, there was no sound at all. No one spoke. No one moved. The only sound was the low hum of the refrigerators behind the bar. The boy on the stage slowly opened his eyes, blinking in the bright light. He looked out at the crowd, his expression dazed, as if he were waking from a dream. He saw a sea of faces all turned towards him, their expressions a mixture of shock, awe, and deep, profound emotion. The silence stretched on, heavy and meaningful, a testament to the power of what they had just witnessed. The invisible boy had been seen, and in the process, he had made everyone in that room feel something real. The final note faded away, but the silence it left behind was louder than any noise the bar had produced all night. It was a heavy, sacred quiet, a space filled with the ghost of the melody that had just passed through. The boy on the stage sat frozen, his fingers still hovering over the strings of his guitar. He slowly opened his eyes, blinking against the single spotlight that felt suddenly too bright. The world came back into focus, but it was a different world than the one he had stepped onto the stage in. The faces were no longer turned away, lost in their own conversations. They were all turned towards him. A sea of strangers, their expressions a mixture of shock, awe, and something he couldn't quite name, but felt deep in his own chest. He saw the woman with the tear-streaked makeup. He saw the bartender, his arms crossed, a look of profound respect on his face. He saw the cynical musician in the back, staring with an expression of pure, unadulterated envy. They had all heard him. They had all seen him. The silence was broken by a single sound. It was the sharp, distinct clap of a pair of hands, coming from the back of the room. It was followed by another, and then another. Slowly, like a handful of pebbles starting a landslide, the applause began to grow. It wasn't polite or tentative. It built into a thunderous, deafening roar that shook the dusty walls of the rusty nail. People were on their feet, cheering, whistling, their faces illuminated with a raw, unguarded emotion. The sound washed over the boy, a wave of approval so overwhelming it almost knocked him off his stool. He felt his own cheeks grow hot, a flush of shock and disbelief spreading through him. This wasn't for him? It couldn't be? He was just a kid who played a song. But the roar continued, growing louder, more insistent. He didn't know what to do. He gave a clumsy, awkward nod, a small, uncertain wave of his hand. The response was another massive cheer. He felt a hand on his shoulder. It was the host, the skinny guy with the goatee, whose face now held no boredom, only a wide, genuine grin. "Kid," he said, his voice full of a new kind of respect. "That was... wow. Just wow." The boy managed a shaky smile and began to pack up his guitar, his fingers still trembling. As he stepped off the stage, the crowd parted for him. People reached out, not to grab him, but to touch his arm, to pat his back. "That was beautiful," a woman whispered, her eyes still shining. "You have a real gift?" said a man in a flannel shirt, his voice thick with emotion. The cynical musician met his eyes as he passed and simply nodded, a gesture of acknowledgement that meant more than any applause. For the first time in his life, people weren't looking through him. They were looking at him, and they liked what they saw. He scanned the room, his heart pounding with a new kind of anticipation. He was looking for one face, one reaction that mattered more than all the others combined. He expected to see his dad sitting at the bar, maybe with a beer, watching with that quiet, proud smile he knew so well. But his dad wasn't there. A small pang of disappointment hit him. Maybe he hadn't come. Maybe he'd decided it was just a silly bar and his son's music wasn't worth the late night out. The boy pushed the thought away, clutching his guitar case and trying to navigate his way through the crowd that still wouldn't let him go. Everyone wanted a piece of him, to share in the magic he had created. He finally made it to the back of the room, near the exit, and that's when he saw him. His dad wasn't at the bar. He was standing in the darkest corner of the room, almost hidden in the shadows, as if he didn't want to take any attention away from his son. He was leaning against the wall, and in the dim light the boy could see that his face was wet with tears. But he wasn't just crying. He was smiling. It was the widest, proudest, most beautiful smile the boy had ever seen. It was the smile from the old photograph, the smile of a young man with a dream. But now it was etched onto the face of a father. A man who had seen his own deferred dreams fulfilled in his son. The boy stopped walking. The noise of the bar, the people patting his back, the host calling his name for an encore, it all faded into a dull hum. All he could see was his dad. He pushed his way through the last few people separating them and walked slowly towards the man who had given him everything. When he reached him, he didn't say a word. He just stood there, his guitar case hanging from his hand. His dad pushed himself off the wall and wrapped his strong, calloused arms around his son, pulling him into a hug so tight it almost took his breath away. The boy buried his face in his dad's worn jacket, smelling the familiar scent of sawdust and sweat and love. He felt his dad's hand on the back of his head, a gesture of comfort and pride that needed no words. After a long moment, his dad pulled back, his hand still on the boy's shoulders. He looked at him, his eyes shining. "You heard?" the boy asked, his voice barely a whisper. His dad just nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He finally cleared his throat and said, "I heard everything, son. It was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." That was it. That was the gift. Not the applause, not the praise from strangers, but those simple words from the one person who truly understood. They walked out of the bar together, leaving the noise and the lights behind. The cold night air felt clean and sharp against their faces. They didn't talk on the walk home. They didn't need to. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with the music, with the shared memory of that perfect, powerful moment. The streetlights cast long shadows in front of them, but for the first time, the boy didn't feel like he was walking in darkness. He was walking beside his hero, his father, his biggest fan. He was still the same quiet kid from a small town, but something inside him had fundamentally changed. He had found his voice, not in the words he spoke, but in the music he played. And as he walked home under the quiet stars, he knew he would never be invisible again.